September 1968. Forward Operating Base, Bon Mi Thuat. Colonel William "Red" Patterson had commanded the southern sector of MACV-SOG for 14 months. During that time, he had written 17 letters to the families of fallen soldiers. He had personally overseen 43 operations behind enemy lines in Cambodia. He had watched good men walk into the triple canopy jungle and never return. But the secret telegram he was currently drafting for MACV headquarters in Saigon contained words he never thought he would write. 3 words capable of destroying his career if seen by the wrong people, requesting Australian replacement. The men who were the reason for this telegram were sitting in his operational debriefing room right now. 4 operators from the 2nd Squadron of the Australian SAS, 12 days in denied territory, 0 casualties, 14 confirmed enemy kills. And intelligence on 3 North Vietnamese Army supply depots that Pentagon analysts had been trying to locate for 2 years. An American reconnaissance team that had attempted the same route 6 weeks earlier had returned with only 2 survivors out of 12. But to understand why a decorated Special Forces colonel was ready to admit that his own teams couldn't compare to what these tanned boys from Perth and Brisbane had achieved, to understand why American operators had started asking to patrol with the Australians instead of leading their own teams, one must go back to a training camp near Canungra in Queensland, where these men mastered a style of warfare the American military had forgotten existed. This story was never meant to become public knowledge. The Pentagon classified it for 50 years. The Australian Department of Defense refused to comment. MACV-SOG veterans signed non-disclosure agreements for life. But documents eventually surfaced. And what they contain overturns everything Americans are used to thinking about their military superiority in Vietnam. Let's start with the numbers that made the Pentagon nervous. By mid-1968, American Special Operations units in Vietnam were suffering catastrophic losses. MACV-SOG teams conducting reconnaissance operations behind the lines in Laos and Cambodia were losing an average of 30% of their personnel on every mission lasting longer than 5 days. Some Green Beret units recorded casualties of up to 40% in individual operations. It was a meat grinder the American public had absolutely no idea about. Now, the Australian numbers. For the entire year of 1968, the Australian SAS conducted over 200 patrols in Phuoc Tuy Province and surrounding areas. Total casualties for the year were 11 wounded and 2 killed in action. Meanwhile, the confirmed body count of eliminated enemy combatants exceeded 500. The kill ratio was 1 to 250. For American Special Operations units during the same period, that ratio fluctuated between 1 to 8 and 1 to 15. When these numbers first landed on the desks of Defense Intelligence Agency analysts in Washington, their initial reaction was disbelief. The Australians were clearly inflating their stats or underreporting their own losses, the Pentagon decided. Such efficiency simply couldn't exist. The U.S. Army had the best equipment, the best air support, the best intelligence, and 10 times the budget. How could a handful of Australians from a country with a population smaller than New York outperform the elite of U.S. Special Forces? But that was only the beginning of the unpleasant discoveries for the American military establishment. In March 1968, the Pentagon sent a special observation group to study Australian methods. The group was led by Major Robert Mackenzie, a Green Beret veteran with 2 tours of Vietnam under his belt. He was accompanied by 2 intelligence officers and a small unit tactics specialist. Their mission was simple: find out the Australians' secret and adapt their methods for American units. What Mackenzie discovered at the Nui Dat base upended everything he had been taught at Fort Bragg. The first thing that struck the American observers was the size of the Australian patrol groups. A standard MACV-SOG reconnaissance team numbered 12 men, 3 Americans and 9 indigenous fighters from hill tribes. An Australian SAS patrol consisted of 5 men. Just 5. No local guides, no interpreters, no support. 5 Australians against a jungle teeming with thousands of Viet Cong. Mackenzie was convinced this was suicide. He wrote in his diary, "Either these men are lunatics or they know something we don't." It turned out to be the latter. Australian patrol tactics were radically different from the American approach. Where Americans relied on firepower and speed, Australians bet on invisibility and patience. A typical American patrol moved at a speed of 2 to 3 kilometers per hour, relying on the ability to call in air support in case of enemy contact. An Australian SAS patrol covered no more than 500 meters per hour, sometimes less. 500 meters per hour. Mackenzie couldn't believe it wasn't a typo in the report. But the secret lay precisely in this tortoise-like pace. The Australians didn't just walk through the jungle. They became part of the jungle. Every step was calculated so as not to break a single twig, not to disturb a single leaf. Every few minutes, the patrol would freeze in place, sometimes for up to half an hour, listening and watching. They moved so quietly that Viet Cong patrols passed within meters of them, unaware of their presence. American Green Berets called this, quote, 4. The Viet Cong gave the Australians a different name, quote, 5, which meant, quote, 6, and this name carried fear, not respect. But the most shocking discovery for Mackenzie was how the Australians used Aboriginal trackers. Serving within the Australian contingent in Vietnam were several dozen Aborigines who had undergone special training as trackers. These men possessed skills that seemed supernatural to the Americans. They could determine how many people had passed along a trail, how long ago, whether they were carrying loads, whether there were wounded among them, all from barely visible traces a white man simply wouldn't see. Sergeant Jimmy Nungarai of the Warlpiri people became a legend among American Special Forces. Once, he tracked a group of Viet Cong through 9 kilometers of jungle, navigating solely by broken spiderwebs and disturbed moss. When the group was finally located, Nungarai correctly stated their number, 17 men, even though he had only seen tracks left 3 days prior. The Americans tried to hire Aboriginal trackers directly. The Pentagon was willing to pay triple what the Australian government was paying, but the Aborigines refused to work with the Americans. The reason was simple. American methods of warfare contradicted everything their ancestors had taught them. The Americans were too loud, too fast, too dependent on technology. They didn't understand the jungle. They feared the jungle, and you cannot defeat that which you fear. This principle lay at the heart of all Australian tactics in Vietnam. But what Mackenzie discovered next made him question whether he wanted to document what he saw at all. Australian psychological warfare methods went far beyond what was permitted by American regulations in the Geneva Conventions. At the Nui Dat base, there was an unwritten practice that was rarely spoken of aloud. After successful ambushes, Australians left enemy bodies in a specific way. Sometimes it was, quote, 7, aces of spades stuffed into the mouths of the dead. Sometimes it was something far more macabre. One veteran of the 2nd Squadron, who agreed to speak on condition of anonymity 40 years after the war, described the standard procedure. After an ambush, bodies were arranged in poses mimicking daily activities. One would be, quote, 8, quote, and, quote, 9, quote, a weapon. Another, quote, 10, quote, rice. A third, quote, 11, quote, a letter. It was a message for those who would find the bodies. We can come at any moment and you won't even hear us. Mackenzie was horrified, and simultaneously in awe. The psychological effect of these methods was colossal. By mid-1968, the Viet Cong command in Phuoc Tuy province issued a special directive. Avoid contact with Australian units at any cost. It was an unprecedented document. The Viet Cong had never issued such orders regarding American or South Vietnamese troops. But the Australians inspired such fear that their mere presence in an area forced the enemy to retreat. One intercepted Viet Cong radio exchange contained a phrase that became legendary among SAS veterans. Better to face a company of Americans than 5 Australian ghosts. A company of Americans meant 150 men with artillery support and helicopters on standby. 5 Australian ghosts meant 5 men with rifles and knives. But the Viet Cong preferred the former. That spoke volumes. Major Mackenzie spent 3 weeks at the Nui Dat base. During that time, he participated in 2 Australian patrols as an observer. What he saw changed his understanding of war forever. The first patrol lasted 8 days. 8 days in the jungle without a single word spoken aloud. All communication was conducted via hand signals. The Australians had developed their own sign language consisting of over 300 signals. They slept in shifts, never removing their gear, ready for combat at any second. They didn't build fires, didn't smoke, didn't use insect repellent. The smell could betray their presence. They ate cold rations and drank water from streams, adding purification tablets. On the 3rd day, the patrol discovered a Viet Cong camp. 23 enemy fighters were resting in the location, unaware that 5 pairs of eyes were watching them from less than 100 meters away. American tactics would have required calling in an immediate airstrike or artillery support. The Australians did nothing of the sort. They watched for 48 hours. Mackenzie later wrote that those 48 hours were the hardest test of his life. Lying motionless in the tropical heat, insects crawling under his clothes, every muscle screaming in pain, the enemy just steps away and doing nothing, just watching, memorizing, waiting. At the end of the 2nd day, the Australian Patrol Commander, Sergeant First Class Kevin quote 14 McGregor, made a decision. Do not attack. withdraw. The intelligence gathered over those 48 hours was more important than 23 dead Viet Cong. The patrol silently dissolved into the jungle, and the enemy never knew they had been under surveillance. That intelligence later allowed for the identification and destruction of a North Vietnamese Army regimental headquarters. 600 enemy fighters were eliminated in a single operation, thanks to the patience of 5 men who chose information over immediate glory. Mackenzie was stunned. American military culture cultivated aggression, initiative, immediate action. Quote 15. This doctrine was drilled into the head of every American officer. The Australians practiced something directly opposite. Quote 16. And it worked. But the second patrol showed Mackenzie the other side of Australian methods, the side that made him think about the moral boundaries of war. The patrol was, quote 17, quote, the target. A Viet Cong officer named Nguyen Van Thu, commander of a local guerrilla network responsible for the execution of 8 South Vietnamese officials and their families. The American command had been hunting him for 6 months without success. The Australians needed 4 days. How they found him contradicted all of Mackenzie's ideas about military intelligence. No spy networks, no prisoner interrogations, no technical gadgets. Just an Aboriginal tracker named Billy, who literally sniffed out Thu's trail through the jungle. Billy could determine that the person who left the track smoked a specific brand of cigarettes, that he walked with a limp in his left leg, that he was carrying a submachine gun on his shoulder rather than a rifle, all from microscopic changes in the depth and shape of the footprints. When the patrol discovered Thu's hideout, Mackenzie expected an ambush or a call for support. Instead, the patrol commander, Lieutenant Trevor Angel Wilkins, did something completely unexpected. He entered the hideout alone, armed only with a knife. Mackenzie never found out exactly what happened inside. Wilkins was gone for 17 minutes. When he came out, there wasn't a drop of blood on his uniform. Thu was never seen again. His body was never found. Many years later, retired, Mackenzie told the story to a journalist investigating war crimes in Vietnam. "Abersbach, quote 19, he said, Reichats, quote 20. And this brings us to the main question that tormented the Pentagon throughout the war. Is efficiency worth moral compromises? The Australian methods worked. The numbers didn't lie, but the price of that efficiency raised serious questions. Mackenzie's report, submitted to the Pentagon in June 1968, was classified immediately after being read. Official reason, quote, 21 real reason, the American command could not officially admit that allies were outperforming them in professionalism, nor did they want to document methods that clearly violated international conventions. But unofficially, Mackenzie's recommendations began to be implemented. By late 1968, MACV-SOG revised its patrol tactics. Team sizes were reduced from 12 to 8 men. Movement speed was decreased. Greater emphasis was placed on observation rather than immediate contact. American Special Forces began to learn from the Australians, though officially this was never acknowledged. And then came the requests. At first, they were isolated incidents. A MACV-SOG recon team leader would request permission for a joint operation with the Australian SAS, then another, and another. By mid-1969, there were so many such requests that MACV Command created a special procedure to process them. But the truly alarming reports began arriving in August of that year. Captain James "Cowboy" Rodriguez, team leader of SOG Team Oklahoma, refused to return to American tactics after 3 joint operations with the Australians. In his report, he wrote, "My men no longer want to operate by our methods. They have seen how war can be fought differently. They have seen that our tactics are organized suicide. I request permission for permanent attachment to the Australian contingent." Rodriguez was denied, but his report wasn't unique. Over the next 6 months, MACV Command received 23 similar requests from MACV-SOG officers and sergeants. 23 experienced special operators, the elite of the U.S. Armed Forces, were asking for permission to work under Australian command instead of American. It was an unprecedented blow to the Pentagon's ego. And that was when Colonel Patterson's telegram was born. Patterson was not a sentimental man. 22 years in the Army had taught him to value results above all else. When he looked at the casualty statistics for his sector, he didn't see numbers. He saw the faces of the boys he sent on missions. Many of those faces would never smile at their mothers again. His telegram was short and brutally honest. Recommend gradual replacement of U.S. reconnaissance teams in sector with Australian units. U.S. personnel losses in long-range reconnaissance operations exceed acceptable limits. Australian methods provide equivalent intelligence results with losses 10 to 15 times lower. Recommend requesting increase in Australian contingent. The telegram reached the deputy commander of MACV, General Crichton Abrams. Rumor has it that after reading it, he threw the document across his office. "I am not going to tell Washington that we need more Australians because our boys aren't good enough," he allegedly said. Patterson was transferred to a staff position in Saigon 2 weeks later. Official reason: scheduled rotation. Real reason: he dared to speak the truth that no one wanted to hear. But the Australians continued to demonstrate results that were impossible to ignore. In October 1969, an incident occurred that later became known as the 7-Minute Affair. An Australian patrol of 5 men commanded by Corporal Richard Phantom Hayes encountered a North Vietnamese company, over 100 men. By all laws of military science, the 5 Australians should have been wiped out in minutes. Instead, something incredible happened. Hayes decided not to retreat and not to call for support. He decided to attack. The patrol opened fire from ambush, creating the impression that their numbers were much greater. They used noise trap techniques, pre-positioned devices mimicking gunfire sounds from different locations. They constantly changed positions, preventing the enemy from determining their strength and location. In 7 minutes of combat, they eliminated 19 enemy fighters, wounded an unknown number, and forced the company to retreat. 5 against more than 100. 7 minutes, 0 Australian casualties. When the report on the 7-Minute Affair reached the Pentagon, it was initially dismissed as probable falsification. It took 2 independent investigations and the debriefing of all participants to confirm that everything happened exactly as described. But by that time, the war was already winding down. American public opinion had turned against the conflict. Nixon had begun the program of Vietnamization, the gradual withdrawal of American troops. The lessons the Pentagon could have learned from the Australian experience were shelved. And here begins the most interesting part of this story. What happened after the war? The Australian SAS returned home with priceless experience that no other Western special unit possessed. They had fought against a guerrilla army in tropical jungle conditions for 10 years. They had developed tactics that allowed a handful of men to control territory where the enemy had absolute numerical superiority. And most importantly, they preserved this experience and passed it on to the next generations. American Special Forces, on the other hand, preferred to forget Vietnam like a bad dream. The Green Berets lost most of their veterans, who left the Army in the 70s, disillusioned with the military system. MACV-SOG was disbanded, its archives classified, its methods deemed obsolete. The U.S. Army returned to the doctrine of massive force application to tank armadas and airstrikes. The results of these different approaches manifested 20 years later. When Operation Desert Storm began in 1991, the Australian SAS found themselves in Iraq, once again side by side with American and British allies, and once again, the Australians demonstrated an efficiency that astonished the Americans. Australian patrols penetrated deep into Iraqi territory, locating Scud missile launchers, directing airstrikes, and gathering intelligence. Their operations were so successful that Coalition Command entrusted them with the entire western sector of Iraq, an area the size of Texas. 60 Australian Special Forces operators controlled what had been planned for an American division. History was repeating itself, and Americans were asking themselves the same questions again. After Desert Storm ended, the Pentagon conducted a massive analysis of the effectiveness of Allied special units. The results were classified, but leaks in the 90s confirmed what many suspected. The Australian SAS had once again shown results significantly superior to American counterparts on a per-person basis. The report contained a recommendation: study Australian training methods and adapt them for U.S. Special Operations units. This time, the Pentagon listened. In 1994, an exchange program began in which U.S. Navy SEALs and Delta operators underwent training at the Australian SAS Training Center in Canungra. The instructors teaching them were Vietnam veterans and their students. They were passing on methods the Americans had rejected 30 years prior. Sergeant Major Kevin Smoke McGregor, the very same patrol commander who had shown Mackenzie the art of patience in 1968, was heading the tracker training program by then. When the first group of American trainees arrived, he greeted them with words that became legendary. "Your fathers rejected what we tried to teach them. They paid for it in blood. Now you have a chance not to repeat their mistakes. The question is whether you have the humility to admit you don't know everything." These words were recorded by one of the American trainees, who later became a Navy SEAL team commander. He quoted them in an interview after retiring. "McGregor taught us more in 3 months than we learned in 3 years in Coronado. But the main thing, he taught us to listen to the jungle. Most Americans never understood what that meant." And what does listen to the jungle mean? The answer to this question is rooted in what Australian soldiers learned from Aboriginal trackers from the early days of colonizing the continent. For Aborigines, the land was not an inert backdrop for human activity. The land was a living being that spoke to those who knew how to listen. A broken branch told a story. A footprint in the sand contained information about who passed, when, where, and why. Australian soldiers adapted this philosophy to war. They learned to read the jungle the way their ancestors learned to read the desert, and this gave them an advantage that no technology could compensate for. American military culture was built on a fundamentally different foundation. For Americans, the jungle was a hostile environment that needed to be conquered using firepower, chemicals, and technology. Ranger meant someone who moves through hostile territory. The Australian SAS practiced a different principle: become part of that territory. The difference wasn't just philosophical. It was measured in human lives. By the early 2000s, cooperation between the Australian SAS and U.S. special units reached an unprecedented level. Operations in Afghanistan and Iraq were conducted jointly with integrated tactics and personnel exchange. American commanders openly admitted that Australian methods of long-range patrolling and counterinsurgency warfare were superior to their own, but the admission came too late and at too high a price. Between 1965 and 1973, the United States lost over 58,000 men in Vietnam. Australia lost 521. The ratio of losses to population size was comparable, but the ratio of losses to achieved military results was not. During the war, the Australian SAS eliminated over 500 confirmed enemy fighters, captured and interrogated hundreds of prisoners, and gathered tons of intelligence material. Their own irrevocable losses amounted to 2 men killed directly in combat action from the SAS ranks, a ratio of roughly 250 to 1. The analogous figure for American Special Operations units in Vietnam, by various estimates, fluctuated between 5 to 1 and 15 to 1, 15 against 250. That proportion speaks for itself. And now, as archives are declassified, as veterans agree to speak, as historians gain access to documents that gathered dust in Pentagon and Canberra safes for half a century, we can ask the main question: why? Why was a handful of Australians from a country with a population smaller than a single American state able to surpass the most powerful military machine in human history? There are several answers, and all of them are uncomfortable for American pride. The first answer is cultural. Australia is a country built in the harshest natural conditions. Australian settlers learned to survive in a hostile environment from day one. They adopted the experience of Aborigines, adapted it, and passed it from generation to generation. For an Australian soldier, the jungles of Vietnam were just another form of, quote, 42, a harsh but knowable environment. American culture was built on different principles. Americans were used to conquering nature, not adapting to it. They laid railroads through mountains, drained swamps, air-conditioned the air. When this culture collided with a jungle that could not be BD, quote, 43, by napalm, Agent Orange, or carpet bombing, the result was predictable. The second answer is organizational. The Australian SAS was a small, elite unit where every operator underwent years of training. The washout rate during selection was over 90%. Those who remained were truly the best of the best. The American system of a mass army worked differently. The Green Berets were trained quickly, their numbers growing exponentially in response to the demands of the war. By 1968, about 7,000 Special Forces soldiers were serving in the U.S. Army. In the Australian SAS in Vietnam, there were never more than 200 men at any one time. Quality inevitably yielded to quantity. The third answer is tactical. Australian doctrine was developed for small wars, for counterinsurgency operations, for conflicts where the enemy dissolves among the population. American doctrine was created for World War III, for tank battles in Europe, for the massive application of force against regular armies. Vietnam turned out not to be the war the Americans had prepared for. And the fourth answer is the most uncomfortable one. The Australians were willing to do what the Americans officially dared not. Psychological warfare methods, interrogations, quote, 44 eliminations without witnesses. All this was part of the Australian arsenal. Not because the Australians were more cruel, but because they understood. In guerrilla warfare, there are no clean victories. The American military machine was too big, too public, too accountable to public opinion to afford the methods the Australians used. Every American serviceman knew his actions could end up on the front page of the New York Times. An Australian SAS operator worked in the shadows that reporters didn't even suspect existed. This is not a justification for war crimes. It is a statement of the reality of war. which people prefer not to discuss in public. Colonel Patterson's telegram never led to the official replacement of American units with Australian ones. The Pentagon could not allow such a blow to its prestige. Instead, it was decided to quote 45 and quote 46. But unofficially, many American commanders on the ground did exactly what Patterson recommended. They minimized the use of their men in high-risk operations and relied on Australians wherever possible. They saved the lives of their soldiers, shielding themselves with bureaucratic language and secret memorandums. Patterson lived to be 92. He passed away in 2015 in a nursing home in Virginia. Until his final days, he refused to discuss his telegram with journalists. But in private conversations with historians, he said, Pishkert quote 47. The Australian veterans mentioned in this story are also mostly gone. Kevin Kamar quote 48. McGregor passed away in 2011, surrounded by students who continue his work. Richard Washer Cha quote 49. Hayes never gave a single interview before his passing in 2008. Trevor Madirja quote 50. Wilkins vanished from the public eye after the war, and his fate remains unknown. Some believe he continued working for Australian intelligence services, but their legacy lives on. Today, the Australian SAS is considered one of the best special units in the world. U.S. Navy SEALs and Delta Force officially recognize them as equal partners. And when young American operators undergo training at Canungra, they learn what their predecessors didn't want to learn 50 years ago. Listen to the jungle, the Australian instructors tell them. The land will tell you everything you need to know. You just have to learn to listen. These words sound almost mystical, but behind them lies a simple truth confirmed by thousands of operations. In war, the victor is not the one with the most firepower, but the one who better understands the battlefield. The Australians understood this before the Americans, and the price of American arrogance is measured not in figures in reports, but in graves at Arlington Cemetery. This is a story the Pentagon didn't want to tell, a story of how a small ally nation taught a superpower how to fight, a story of how pride costs lives, a story of the phantoms of the jungle who taught America to listen. And perhaps the most important lesson of this story is that it was never fully learned, because the next time the American Army faces a guerrilla war in unfamiliar terrain, it will once again learn from its own mistakes instead of learning from the experience of others. Some lessons have to be repeated over and over again, at the cost of those who pay for someone else's arrogance with their lives. Colonel Patterson's telegram now lies in the National Archives, declassified after the expiration of the secrecy term. 3 words that could have changed the course of the war. Requesting Australian replacement. 3 words that no one wanted to hear.